Good afternoon, friends. Today we will discuss Unit 5 of International Business. It is related to WTO agreements. Before starting our discussion, let me first tell you what will be the objective of our class. First, we will discuss something on GATT. What is GATT? General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. It is a predecessor to WTO. Then we will explain the structure of WTO. Once GATT is over, WTO comes into picture. First we will discuss regarding GATT, then we will discuss regarding WTO. Then we will discuss some key agreements made under WTO forum. Next we will explain the trade policy review mechanism under WTO. And at last we will discuss India's experience under WTO regime. Under WTO, whether India has progressed or not, we will discuss all these things. So the structure of our discussion will be as follows. First, I will give introduction to WTO. Then we will discuss structure of WTO. Next, we will discuss principles of WTO. Next, we will discuss agreements of WTO. Next, we will discuss key agreements of WTO, trade issues at WTO, trade policy review mechanism at WTO, and India's experience at WTO. And we will summarize our discussion. We will discuss some keywords, some question, and some reference material. And this will be the structure of our discussion. Let me first give an introduction of WTO. In the year 1944, when World War II was over, in 1944, in a place called Bretton Woods, it is situated at New Hampshire, USA. "44 countries meet together and they decide how to restore international trade, because after World War II, the international trade was devastated. No country believes other country. The international trade was very less. World was destroyed due to World War II. So the countries decided to restore the world which was destroyed by World War II. For this, the 44 countries sat in a particular place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, USA, where they decide how to restore the world devastated by World War II. At that Bretton Woods conference, all the 44 nations have decided to set up three important institutions. First institution, they have decided to set up a bank which will provide finance for developmental project, and that bank is known as IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and later on this particular bank becomes World Bank. Then another institution the countries have decided to set up, that is known as IMF, International Monetary Fund. World Bank provide loans for developmental projects, and IMF provide loans to those countries which face BOP crisis. What is BOP crisis? International payment crisis. For the purpose of international trade, one country must have adequate forex reserve. If a country does not have forex reserve to do international trade, then it can approach IMF for loan. So IMF is also a bank. It provides loans to countries which are facing BOP crisis. But IBRD is a bank which provides loans for different developmental projects. So these two institutions, apart from them, that these 44 countries have decided to set up one particular organization. That organization is known as ITO, International Trade Organization. International Trade Organization. So the countries decided to set up three institutions. but two institutions would be formed, IBRD and IMF. But ITO, International Trade Organization, which was planned as a permanent institute which will frame rules and regulations for international trade. Rules and regulations for international trade. So, ITO could not be formed. So, out of three institutions, IBRD and IMF were formed, but ITO could not be formed. So, because USA opposed to the idea of ITO, ITO का आइडिया को यूएसए अपोज किया था. ये वर्ल्ड वॉर 2 में यूएसए वाज द क्लीन विनर. देयरफॉर यूएसए सपोर्टेड आईबीआरडी एंड आईएमएफ, बट इट अपोज्ड आईटीओ. सो आईटीओ कुड नॉट बी फॉर्म. As ITO could not be formed, the countries later on decided to make a temporary arrangement or temporary agreement within the framework of which the international trade will take place. That temporary agreement is known as GATT agreement. So GATT is a temporary arrangement. So why GATT was made? GATT was a temporary arrangement. The countries have decided to frame GATT, which will be a temporary arrangement, and it will be existence till ITO is formed. So countries were trying to frame ITO as a permanent institution, but up to the time ITO is framed, they have arranged one temporary agreement within the purview of which the international trade will take place. So GATT is a predecessor to ITO. So we will discuss one by one. GATT. First, we will discuss the discussion of WTO for GATT. So what is GATT? I have discussed GATT is a multilateral agreement, and it frames rules for conducting international trade. And it came into existence on 1st January 1948. 4 years after Bretton Woods Conference, GATT was formed, and this agreement was prevalent for next 47 years till WTO was formed. GATT was framed to frame ITO, but ITO could not be formed. Instead of ITO, another institution formed, that is known as WTO. So from 1948 to 1995, the GATT agreement was the prominent agreement within which international trade was taking place. Okay, so we have discussed GATT was framed in 1948, and all the discussion regarding GATT was made between countries which were trying to frame ITO, and in between them they have made a stopgap arrangement like GATT to frame rules regulations for international trade. The first round of negotiation under GATT was made in 1947. It was in Geneva. Only 23 countries joined this particular agreement, and the subject discussed was tariff. Tariff is a barriers to international trade. Tariff means tax barriers. The tax barrier is discussed here, and these 23 countries have decided to reduce tariff between trades between themselves. If there will be international trade, how the tariffs will be reduced, so that there will be ultimately free flow of goods and services between different countries. Next round of negotiations was made in 1949. It was in Annecy. 1951 in Turkey, 1956 Geneva, 1960-61 Geneva, and all these times the tariff was the main point of discussion. Now please see, in between them, some countries have joined GATT agreement and some countries have left the GATT agreement. The number of countries which joined GATT agreement at the time of starting of GATT was 23. Later on in 1949 it reduced to 13. In Turkey round of discussion it was 38. In Geneva it again came down to 26. But in the year 1964 and 67, a milestone occurred in the history of GATT where 62 countries agreed upon GATT agreement and they have discussed on tariff and anti-dumping measures. In 1970, the number again increased to 102, and during 86 to 94, during Geneva Uruguay round negotiations, 123 countries were signatory to GATT agreements, and during this Uruguay round they have decided to frame a permanent institution that is known as WTO. Instead of ITO, they have agreed to form a permanent institution which will be termed as WTO. And in that agreements, they have discussed regarding tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, services rule, intellectual property related rule, dispute settlement. Major round of discussion of WTO was made during Uruguay round of GATT discussion during 1986 to 1994. Finally, in the year 1994, during Geneva round of negotiation at Marrakesh Declaration, WTO was framed, and WTO came into existence on 1st January 1995. So this is the history of formation of WTO. So WTO was framed on January 1, 1995. So WTO is a successor to GATT. Once WTO comes, GATT loses its importance. GATT become a part of WTO. Now GATT agreement is the first founding agreement of WTO. So when WTO was framed, at first 76 government becomes the member of WTO. Again, more and more members joined, and nowadays WTO membership contribute 98% of the world trade. So what is the functions of WTO? Main functions of WTO. WTO is a permanent multilateral institution which frame rules, regulations for international trade. So what is the key functions of WTO? We will discuss. What is the main function of WTO? What is the key function of WTO? WTO functions can be discussed under 5 headings. First function is administering and implementing multilateral and plurilateral trade agreements. Trade agreements are made under WTO forms, and it acts as a multilateral trade negotiations. Not only trade agreements are made, trade negotiations are made, trade disputes are settled under WTO, then trade policies are overseen in WTO forum, and there is cooperation with other international institutions involved in global policy making under WTO. So these are the main functions of WTO. The main point of difference between GATT and WTO we will discuss now. So what is the main point of difference between GATT and WTO? I have already discussed GATT is just a temporary arrangement. It is just an agreement, but WTO is a permanent institution. So GATT is not a permanent institution. It is a temporary arrangement. It is an agreement, but WTO is a permanent institution. The GATT provisions are applicable on provisional basis, not on permanent commitment, no permanent commitment. But in case of WTO, there is full and permanent commitment. And GATT agreements are multilateral agreements, but WTO agreements are multilateral agreements plus commitment of the members. In case of GATT, the dispute settlement system is slow, less automatic, but in case of WTO, the dispute settlement system is faster, automatic. The membership of WTO GATT is less global. but the membership of WTO is more global. Many countries have joined WTO. Around about 98% of the global trade making countries have already joined WTO. And the policies of GATT is tolerated policy of protection in term of sensitive area. GATT agreement provides protectionism for sensitive areas, but WTO aims at reversing policy of protectionism in certain sensitive area. The main point of difference between GATT and WTO is this: GATT frames rules regulations for international trade of goods only. GATS में सिर्फ goods का रूल्स रेगुलेशन है इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड का, बट WTO consists the rules regulation for international trade of goods, services and IPR or intellectual property rights. It means the scope of WTO is much more broader than the scope of GATT. So how there is a question, activity related question, how WTO is different from GATT in its function. I hope this question is clear. Next, we will discuss something called structure of WTO. How WTO is framed. I have already discussed WTO came into existence in January 1, 1995, and it replaced the previous GATT agreement. Now WTO is a permanent institution. Now today we will discuss what is the structure of WTO. What is the main structure of WTO? In case of WTO, the highest decision making body is ministerial conference. This is the highest decision making body of WTO, ministerial conference. The second most important decision making body is general council. So ministerial conference is the highest decision making body, and second one is general council, and general council controls all other structure of WTO. So there are two things: ministerial conference and general council. So we will discuss the structure of WTO one by one. First, the structure in the structure of WTO, first one is ministerial conference. I have already told the highest decision making body in case of WTO is ministerial conference, and this ministerial conference is the apex governing body of WTO, and it frames the strategic decision in case of WTO. Okay, and the ministerial conference meeting is done at least once in every 2 years. So this particular ministerial conference frame rule regulation for trade of international business, but they only frame the strategic rules, the strategic direction. They do not frame the operational rules. The operational rules are discussed under General Council, but the highest decision making body of WTO is the ministerial conference. Below ministerial conference there is General Council. So what is General Council? General Council considers second decision making body is General Council. General Council is composed of senior country representatives who are in the level of ambassadors of member countries. General Council is the most important organ of WTO, and it frames the day-to-day business rules of WTO. It sees how WTO is functioning. General Council meetings takes place at WTO headquarters, which is situated at Geneva. So the key decisions making body of WTO is General Council. Ministerial conference frame strategic decisions, but the operational decisions are generally made by General Council. Beyond ministerial conference and General Council, there are certain other bodies which constitute WTO. One is Trade Policy Review Body. What is Trade Policy Review Body? This body reviews the trade policy of different member countries. Okay, periodically they they review the trade policy of the member countries, whether the member countries are adhering to the rules, regulations framed by WTO or not. And this particular trade policy review body prepare policy review reports periodically. Okay, and this policy review reports aim at improving adherence of member countries to the commitments and obligations made under WTO. The next important body under WTO is dispute settlement body. So dispute settlement body is another body. It it settles the disputes, trade related disputes between member countries. Okay, so if there is a dispute between member countries, they will approach the dispute settlement body, and there is this is the appellate body. It was established in 1994, and the decision made by dispute settlement body are mandatory and binding on all member countries. Then next one is the council, goods council, services council, intellectual property related councils. These particular councils act under general council. General council consists of all members, but this goods council, services council, they consist of specific members, and in those council specific goods related rules are discussed and negotiated. In service council, service related rules are discussed. Next, the next important body in case of WTO is that is known as the secretariat. We know that the WTO is a huge organization, and it is headed by a secretary which is known as Director General. The Director General heads the secretariat of WTO, and in WTO there are more than 600 employees, and the employees consist of legal expert, economist, trade analyst, counselors, communication experts, etc. The secretariat is responsible for all administrative functions of WTO. So these are certain constituents of WTO. Next, we will discuss what are the principles of WTO. What are the major principles on which WTO is based? WTO's main purpose is to reduce the barriers to international trade. The barriers may be in form of tax barrier and non-tax barriers. Tax barriers and non-tax barriers. Tax barriers are tariff barriers, and non-tax barriers are non-tariff barriers. So WTO's main function is to reduce the barriers in international trade so that ultimately there will be free flow of goods, services, intellectual properties between different countries of the world. This is the main principles or motto of WTO. While conducting these principles, while following these principles, there are certain key principles which WTO usually follows while framing different rules related to international trade. What are those rules? First rule is non-discrimination. What is non-discrimination? WTO believes that the member countries of WTO will not discriminate between the goods produced in their country and the goods produced outside their country. They will not discriminate between own goods and foreign goods. They will not discriminate between own service and foreign service. Next, more open. WTO member countries will be open. Open means they will reduce the barriers to international trade. The barriers may be trade barriers. There will be trade openness. It encourages free flow of goods and services. It discourages tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Next, WTO rules must be predictable and transparent. The WTO rules should be such that it will be predictable. There will be no hidden rules, and it will be transparent. Next important principle is WTO will frame rule in such a way that the members countries will be more competitive. The rules will not be unfair. The rules will not be unlawful. There will not be any restrictive trade practices like quota, subsidy, dumping under WTO. So WTO rules and procedures lay down clear cut defining what is quota, how much quota can be fixed, what is subsidy, how much subsidy can be given, what is dumping, if dumping is there, what is the precaution a country can take. All these things are discussed under WTO. Next, WTO rules must protect the environment. They must have the environmental concerns. The environment, they must protect the environment. Environment issues are taken care of. They will WTO rules are framed in such a way that it will protect not only the biological environment but also it will protect public health, it will protect animal health, it will protect plant health, etc. No country will be allowed to use environmental protection measures to reduce to have protectionist policies, but the environmental issues are there and environmental protection measures can be taken by member countries if environmental issues arises. Next, we will discuss the framework agreement of WTO. What are the important agreements of WTO? We will discuss different framework agreements of WTO. We have discussed that WTO is a big umbrella. In case of this big umbrella, we have agreements related to three major things. What are the three major things? Agreements related to goods, agreement related to services, and agreement related to IPR, intellectual property rights. So three framework is goods related agreement, services related agreement, and intellectual property related agreements. The goods related agreements is known as GATT. We have discussed what is GATT. GATT was there from 1947 to that is 1994. But once WTO is framed, GATT lost its relevance. But GATT becomes a part of WTO. This is the most important agreement of WTO, that is GATT agreement. But this GATT is GATT 1994. Not the old GATT, but it is GATT 1994, which it consists all rules, regulations which was there from 1947 to 1994. The rules and regulations related to services are represented by an agreement. That agreement is known as GATS agreement, General Agreement of Trade in Services. So GATT agreement is related to goods, GATS agreement is related to service, and the agreement related to intellectual property is known as TRIPS agreement. So these are the three major agreements under WTO: GATT, GATS, TRIPS. GATT means rules related to goods, GATS means rules related to service, and TRIPS means rules related to intellectual property rights. And in GATS agreements, there are certain annexures related to other goods agreements. There are goods annexures, there are service annexures, and there are certain market access commitments which are in case of country-wise schedule of commitments. Here is also schedule of commitments are there. And in case of WTO, three major agreements are there, three major goods, services, intellectual property related agreements, plus it has a dispute settlement mechanism and it has a trade policy related mechanism. So these are the framework of WTO. Next, we will discuss one by one the important agreements of WTO. I have discussed the most important agreement of WTO is known as GATT agreement. That's GATT is GATT 1994. So GATT agreement is related to goods. It is also known as agreement on tariffs. In case of GATT agreement, it's the member countries has decided to reduce tariffs. So GATT is a agreement on tariffs, general agreement on trade and tariffs. So GATT agreement is the most voluminous agreement. It consists of 22,500 pages. The GATT agreement consists of the following 4 rules related to goods. First one is MFN rule, most favored nation rule. What is MFN tariff? MFN tariff is the tariff rate at which member countries generally charge on the goods and services imported and exported to their countries. So this is the normal rate. We can call it MFN rate is the normal rate. It is the most restrictive tariff rates a WTO member can charge other members. But sometimes we charge tariff above MFN rate and sometimes we charge tariffs below MFN rate. The below MFN rate is known as preferential tariffs. The countries with which we have preferential agreement, regional blocks, in that case, we charge a tariff below MFN tariff, and this is known as preferential tariff. This tariff is lower than MFN tariff. Then there is a tariff called bound tariff. This is the maximum rate which a country agreed to charge for international trade of goods. It is generally above MFN tariff. So this is the bound tariff is the maximum MFN tariff which a country can charge. That is known as bound tariff. Then there is applied tariff. What is applied tariff? Applied tariff refers to tariff rate which are actually applied on import of particular goods and services. So there are 4 types of tariffs: MFN tariff, normal tariff, then preferential tariff, then bound tariff, then applied tariff. This particular GATT agreements में ये 4 तरह का टैरिफ डिफरेंट टाइप ऑफ गुड्स का लिस्ट है और ये 4 तरह का टैरिफ कितना कितना हर कंट्री चार्ज करेगा उसका कमिटमेंट GATT एग्रीमेंट में. इसीलिए ये एग्रीमेंट 22,500 पेजेस. दिस इज द मोस्ट वॉल्यूमिनस एग्रीमेंट अंडर WTO. The next agreement under WTO regime is Agreement on Agriculture, जिसको शॉर्ट फॉर्म में हम बोलते हैं AOA agreement. Agreement on Agriculture. An agreement on agriculture of WTO is aimed to reform agricultural trade. Agreement on agriculture frames rules, regulations related to purchase, sale of agricultural commodities. And in case of agreement on agriculture, the following 3 commitments are there. What are these commitments? First, market access. All the member countries decided to open their market for agricultural commodities. They have decided to reduce trade restriction in respect of agricultural commodity. Domestic support. The member countries has agreed to reduce the subsidies provided to farmers so that their product becomes competitive in the international market. So in case of domestic support agreement, the countries have agreed to gradually reduce the subsidy. They have agreed to eliminate market distorting subsidies. Those subsidies which make your product cheaper in comparison to other international market product. Then export subsidies. It aims at export of goods and services. Once a person, company involves in export activity, government provides some subsidies. And these subsidies reduce the cost of the exporter. So the countries agreed in case of agreement on agriculture to have market access for agricultural commodity and to reduce the subsidies under domestic support and under export subsidies. Okay, but this agreement has some challenges for developing countries like India. We know that India is a country where most of the people still depend upon agriculture. So if we will reduce the subsidy or if we will cut the subsidy, it will result in several socio-economic issues in India. So Indian government is providing huge agricultural subsidies, but not as huge as developed countries are providing subsidies. Developed countries are providing also subsidies, but these subsidies they have packed in a different way. So the agreement of agriculture generally is liberal towards the subsidy provided by developed country, but it is not liberal towards the subsidies provided by developing countries. So this is a dispute area in case of agreement of agriculture. Next one is GATS agreement. What is GATS agreement? This is the agreement related to trade in services. The rules and regulations for trade in goods is made in GATT agreement. The rules and regulation for trade in services is mentioned in GATS agreement. So GATS agreement is frame rules regulations for services. So there are three things in case of GATS agreement. What is the three things, three elements? First element is the GATS agreement. The main text contain general obligation and discipline. The second related to annexures dealing with rules of specific sectors. And the third part of the GATS agreement is the final framework of individual countries' commitments. So GATS agreement or general agreement on trades in services aims at harmonization of trading rules of services. GATS agreement recognize there are four modes of providing service. What are those four modes of providing service? We will discuss one by one. There are four modes of providing service. Mode one is cross-border trade. What is cross-border trade? It is a delivery of a service from a territory of one country into the territory of other country. You remain in your country but provide service in other country. For example, by remaining in, suppose Harvard Business School has started distance education, and by sitting in India, I can get the education of Harvard Business School. It is mode one. Second one, consumption abroad. That means in order to, first one is cross-border trade, second one is consumption abroad. In order to get the service, I have to go to the foreign country. Let's take an example. Tourism is mode 2. Mode 3, commercial presence. This means the service provider will start their offshore campus in other country. Let's take an example. Harvard Business School want to set up its branch in India. That is known as commercial presence. Mode 4 is presence of natural persons. That means the person who will provide service, he will go to the foreign country and provide the service. Generally, IT employees working in USA. IT employees working in USA. The competition between developed country and developing country is mode 3 and mode 4. Developed country wants developing country to liberalize the rules related to commercial presence. They want to set up their business organization in India and provide service. And developing countries wants developed countries to provide, liberalize the mode for services. Mode for services means commercial presence. That means that means presence of natural person, that is visa issues. We want USA to liberalize visa so more and more people from India can go to US and work there and provide service. US companies, US government want that we must provide commercial presence to their institutions. They will come to India and start their commercial establishment and provide service to Indian people. So the fight between developed country and developing country are related to mode 3 and mode 4 way of providing services. So service related agreement is over. Next agreement is agreement related to IPR, intellectual property rights. So what is intellectual property rights? The WTO agreements recognize there are 7 type of IPRs, and these are bought and sold internationally. And their agreement related to IPR is known as TRIPS agreement, trade related aspect of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS agreement. TRIPS agreement recognize 7 type of IPR. What are the 7 type of IPR? First one is copyright and related rights. Then trademarks. Copyright is a type of IPR. Trademark is a type of IPR. Geographical indicators, GI, is a type of Banarasi Patta. Bengal Rasagolla, Odisha Rasagolla, these are GI tags. Industrial designs, these are international trade. Patents are international trade. Layout of IC, integrated circuits, are trade. Trade secret, undisclosed information, including trade secrets, are internationally trade. So these are 7 IPR which are bought and sold internationally. The TRIPS agreements cover 5 broad areas for rules, regulations related to IPR. What are the 5 broad areas? These are the 5 broad areas you must know for providing IPR rules. First, it frames the manner in which the trading system will operate. Next, it describes with an adequate protection is given to IPR. It explains the procedure how member states should enforce these rights adequately in their own territories. It details mechanism to settle disputes. It provides details on special and transitional agreements related to IPR. Next important agreement is agreement on anti-dumping, subsidy and safeguard contingencies. What is anti-dumping? Dumping means selling a product below its market price in a foreign market. The main purpose of selling the product below its market price is to eradicate the competitors from the market. And once the competitors are eradicated, the foreign firm will create monopoly in the market and charge as per their wish. So dumping is practiced by many countries. China is practicing dumping in case of many products in different countries. So once a country identify that some country is dumping its product in its territory, it can take anti-dumping measures. What is anti-dumping measures? Anti-dumping measures are the actions by member countries against the dumped goods. Dumped goods are sold in the market at very low price, and they can charge countervailing duties in case of dumping, and they can also take safeguards, emergency measures. So if there is dumping, there can be 3 type of measures which you can take. What are the 3 type of measures? One measure is that is anti-dumping duty, another is CVD duty, another is emergency measures you can take. And the situation where these particular things can be taken and the procedure, all these are mentioned in TRIPS agreement. Next agreement is framework agreement on non-tariff measures. I have already discussed there are two type of barriers. One is tariff barriers, another is non-tariff barriers. Tariff barriers are in form of tax, whereas non-tariff barriers are non-tax barriers. So in this case, the non-tariff measures are discussed. The non-tariff barriers are analyzed here in these agreements. The non-tariff barriers may be of three types: technical measures, then there can be financial measures or non-technical measures. So the non-tariff barriers can be of two types: technical measures and non-technical measures. In case of technical measures, we have sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, pre-shipment inspection. In case of non-technical measures, we have contingent trade, non-automatic license, quota, price control measures, financial measures, measures affecting competition, trade-related investment measures, distribution restrictions, restrictions on post-sale services, subsidies, like this. Then last one is we have export measures, that is export-related measures. So the non-tariff barriers agreements deals with the following things: import licensing, rules for valuation of goods, pre-shipment inspection, rules for origin, rules of origin, investment measures. All these measures, all these rules are framed in non-tariff barrier agreements. So these are important agreements under WTO. So the important agreements are GATT agreement, GATS agreement, TRIPS agreement, then agreement upon agriculture, and other important agreements which we have discussed. Next we will discuss what are the evolving trade issues at WTO. What are the recent trade issues which are evolving in WTO? There are many concepts, there are many areas where WTO has to frame new rules and regulations. These are evolving area. First one is regional trade agreements. Many countries are framing regional trade agreements in form of economic integration. Like NAFTA is a regional trade agreement. AFTA is a regional trade agreement. SAARC countries, SAARC is a regional trade agreements. And in this, by doing these regional trade agreements, the member countries provide special facility to those countries which are within that agreements, within that block. With the help of regional trade agreements, countries are framing regional blocks, and they make differential treatment for countries within the block and the countries outside the block. So this has to be taken care of. Next, second issue which WTO must take care of, that is climate change. How climate related technology can be traded throughout the world. Then third one is TFA agreement. This is the most important agreement, trade facilitation agreement. What is trade facilitation agreement? Generally, this agreement tells how the rules and regulations of international trade will be facilitated in different countries so that there will be less red tapaging, less delay in fulfilling the international trade obligations. Trade facilitated agreements. Generally, the international trade are delayed in developing countries. So developed countries are forcing developing countries to sign this particular trade facilitated agreement, yet TFA agreements. Next, trade and electronic commerce. Nowadays, most of the commerce or trade are made electronically, where the payment is made electronically. So many products are bought and sold online, like books, music, videos. How rules regulations for international trade of this electronic commerce will be made, that is a burgeoning issue in WTO. Next one is labor standards. How WTO will frame rules regulation for international labor standards. Labor standards are important. How to restrict use of child labor. how to restrict the role of, how to improve the role of women workers, their working conditions, for how to restrict forced labor, how to restrict how to protect the right of the laborers, all these things, how to take care of the health, safety, working hour issues of different labor organizations. These must be implicated in WTO. Next one is trade policy review. I have told that there is a committee known as Trade Policy Review Committee within the WTO, and it review the trade policies of different countries. The main motive of reviewing trade policy is to first whether the member countries are following the rules regulations framed under WTO through by notification, and whether the countries make regular review of their rules and regulations. So trade policy review is made for a country. So trade policy review are made by WTO for different member countries to increase transparency in trade policy, to strengthen the quality of public life, then to understand the assessment of effect of trade policies. And the trade policy review is done periodically for different type of member countries. Let's take an example. For four major economies, trade policy review is done once in 2 years. What are the four major economy? For European Union, for USA, for Japan, for China, trade policy review is made once in 2 years. For next 16 countries, within which India also comes, the trade policy review is made once in every 4 years. And for the rest of the country, the trade policy review takes place once in every 6 years. So trade policy are reviewed by WTO of different member countries. Next, we will discuss India's experience under WTO. We have discussed that India has started its economic reform in 1991. And from 1991, we have transformed ourselves from a closed economy to an open economy. We have stopped the Inspector Raj. We have stopped the centrally planning model. We have adopted cooperative federalism model. And we have adopted in 1991 new economic policy which focuses on LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And once we adopt these policies and we become a founding member of WTO in 1995, we have opened our economies. Once the economy is open, what happens in India? We see there is enhanced economic activities. There is enhanced economic growth and expansion of, there is industrial diversification, there is increase in the standard of living of our people. It gives confidence to Indian policymakers to liberalize our economy more and more. The per capita of income of India has increased once we adopted the liberalized rules and become a member of WTO, and we do international trade as per WTO regimes. So we can conclude that India has benefited under global trade regime of WTO. Next, we will summarize our discussion. Friends, today we have discussed the setting of WTO. Prior to WTO, there was GATT, and GATT came into existence in 1948, but it was a temporary arrangement. But this temporary arrangement continued for 47 years. In 1995, a permanent institution known as WTO was framed. WTO was a permanent institution which frames rules, regulations of international trade. And with the help of WTO, we administer trade agreements. WTO act as a forum for trade negotiation, we settlement international trade disputes, and we review national trade, international trade policies. And in WTO, there are many agreements we have discussed. The most important agreements are GATT agreement, GATS agreements, and intellectual property rights related agreements or TRIPS agreements. And in WTO, there are different formation of WTO we have discussed. There are ministerial conference, there are different councils, there are the goods council, service council, intellectual property councils, and there is general councils, and there are specialized committees in WTO we have already discussed. Then we have discussed WTO has a secretariat and it has staffs. The WTO secretariat is headed by the Director General. We have discussed. Then we have discussed important agreements of WTO. We have discussed the policies of WTO. We have discussed all those things. Now we'll discuss some of the key words. First, we have discussed a concept called GATT. What is GATT? General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. It is a agreement. It is a agreement. Prior to WTO, international trade was made as per GATT agreement from 1947 onwards, 48 to 1995. GATT was the internationally accepted agreement for international trade. Then multilateral trade. Multilateral trade means trade between different countries, where large group of countries are involved. Next, Uruguay round. This is the most important round of GATT, where the framework of WTO was set up. And this round of negotiation was made between 1986 to 1994, and which led to the formation of WTO as a permanent organization. And what is WTO? We have discussed WTO is a permanent organization. It's a organization which frame rules, regulations for international trade. And there is concept TRIPS and TRIMS. TRIPS means trade related intellectual property rights. It's an agreement related to IPR. TRIMS means trade related investment measures. It's an agreement related to investment, international cross-border investment. The rules regulations related to cross-border investments are mentioned in TRIMS agreement. The rules regulations related to intellectual property rights are mentioned in TRIPS agreement. So what are the important questions? First, what is GATT? Discuss various round of negotiations under GATT. We have discussed. Next, what are the key outcomes of Uruguay round of GATT negotiation? We have discussed out of Uruguay round of GATT discussion, WTO is framed. What is necessity of setting up a WTO? Because it is a permanent institution, its commitments will be permanent. Discuss its aims and objective. We have discussed the aims, objectives of WTO. Next, discuss the framework agreements of WTO. Framework agreements, three important agreements: GATS, TRIPS. These are the framework agreements. GATT is for goods, GATS is for services, TRIPS is for IPR, intellectual property right. What are some of the major areas in which WTO has been focusing on? We have discussed the major areas. And evaluate the current stand of WTO in relation to trade in services. In this context, you have to write regarding GATS agreement. And in relation to agriculture, you have to write regarding AOA. What is AOA? Agreement on Agriculture. TRIPS means trade related intellectual property rights. Next one is write an essay on Indian experience on WTO region. India has gained a lot, we have discussed, under post-WTO regime, and critically examine the organizational structure of WTO. We have discussed what are its key organs. We have already discussed it: Ministerial Conference, General Council, the Goods Council, Services Council, the Review Board, all these things, then Secretariat, all these things we have discussed. And at last, I am giving some reference material for further reading under WTO. Thank you. Thank you for attending my class. Thank you. Thank you all.